Hello and welcome to EQ SYMPHOLIGHT. In the last videos we created sequences, we created layouts, we saw how to define triggers, and this time we will see how to use the ActionPad as a graphical user interface for the end user in a store or wherever SYMPHOLIGHT is used to have only a single point of access to the server without having access to the whole SYMPHOLIGHT interface. And what I did here, I created three sequences in a simple layout. Sequence number one is just a video running, and sequence number two is an effect with an overlay graphical image, and number three is again another video running. And what I did for all the three sequences, I set the videos or the effects to an opacity of 0.5 to be able to overlay the sequences and the output. So here are three sequences which we'll use to create a user interface with the ActionPad with the Graphical User Interface Editor. So I go to the Automation tab and then to the Graphical User Interface Editor, and I create a new target device. Because I want to use my internal browser here in the system, I use desktop and I create a new page for the ActionPad. And the page now has the name page 1. I want to give it another name, I call it main. So this is my main page now. And what I can do now is I can place control elements on the desktop page. Some comments before. When using the ActionPad pages, you have to be sure that the internal web browser of SYMPHOLIGHT is enabled and set to the correct IP address. Here I use the so-called main host interface address, which is my local system. This has to be enabled, and after creating the ActionPad pages, you can access the pages with any modern web browser. Be sure to use only the last versions of Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer, because the ActionPad pages are based on HTML5, and only the very new, the very most recent versions of the browsers support HTML5. Don't try it with the Internet Explorer 8 or 9. After creating the pages, you can either call your local web browser on your system to see the ActionPad and use the ActionPad. The other possibility is to scan with a mobile device this QR code, which represents the IP address of your systems and your local addresses. And then you can, with an iPad or an Android device, have the ActionPad pages on a mobile device, for example, over a wireless network connection or a wired network connection for desktop systems. These are the main prerequisites to be sure to use with the Graphical User Interface Editor and ActionPad pages. I can now place control elements into my ActionPad page. Buttons are control elements that create, when clicked, a single trigger. Toggle buttons create two triggers, one when the button is clicked to the on position, and one different trigger when it is clicked to the off position. With image, you can place any graphical image in your page. With label, you can create a text label. A fader is used to control the opacity of a sequence. Inline frame is a very special element. When placing an inline frame, this is really an HTML frame. And placing an inline frame, you have to provide a URL from a web server. And then the content of a web page is mapped into this frame in your page. And last but not least, the color picker, which can be used to pick a color and assign the color to an element in a sequence. Let's begin with a button. So I drag and drop a button into my page. I want to use another shape. I like the 3D box, and I can provide a label for the button. I want to use this button to control my sequence number 1, so I call it sequence number 1. This is now the text for the button. And what I want to use the button for is I want to execute an action. At the moment no action is assigned. I will use a trigger event which is created when the button is clicked. And to create a trigger event, I create a new trigger event, and this will redirect me to the trigger engine. So when the named event button 1 clicked down was received, I want to execute an action, and this action is execute sequence number 1. I go back to the user interface editor. I already opened my browser on my local system, and here you can see the ActionPad page in the browser with the right address. So this is a button which would execute sequence number 2. I have more than one sequence. I use the same button, I copy and paste. Now I use the same button, but this time it's sequence number 2, and the action that is assigned to the button will now change to another trigger. This is my second button. I assign an action, but this time sequence number 2, back to the graphical user interface. I again copy and paste. And this now is my start button for sequence number 3. And again I need a new action. I create a new action. This time sequence number 3. And now I have 3 buttons. I reopen my browser window. I click F5. Here are my buttons, which can be used to start the sequences. We'll switch to the output window later to see what really happens. One additional notice you should know: in most browsers, keeping the control key pressed and using the mouse wheel, you can zoom in and zoom out to give a better view of your ActionPad page. I want to have another button. I still copy and paste a button, and this will be used to switch anything off, so I call it off. And the action I will assign to this button, I create a new trigger. This is the 4th button, and with this I want to stop all running sequences, stop sequence number 1, stop sequence number 2, and stop sequence number 3. Back to the graphical user interface. I go to the output section. I recall my browser. I press F5 to have the new view. Here's my sequence number 1, sequence number 2, sequence number 3 gets started, and with the off button I switch anything off, or I can run single sequences. Okay, that's fine. And we'll now add a fader. So I drag and drop a fader into my page. Default is a vertical, but I want to have a horizontal fader. I can resize the fader, and I can change many properties of the fader. For example, here I want to have as a trackbar background red, or I want to have the other part green, but I don't want to use a gradient but a single color, so I select green. And now I have a fader. Using the fader for controlling the show as a grandmaster, you should set the maximum of the fader to 1, because what is mapped to the fader is the opacity, and the opacity only runs from 0 to 1 and not to 100. So this is now my fader. Let's see if it works. I go to the output, I call my browser window, F5 to refresh. Here's my fader. We'll now start sequence number 1. And what I did wrong, I did not assign a mapping of the fader. This was wrong. And you have to select a mapping for the fader. You can control the opacity of a single sequence, or you can control the opacity of the whole show. So now I have here assigned show information dot opacity. Going back to the output, going back to the window, and now I can control the opacity of the whole show. That's fine. So as a last step, let's use a color picker. So I drag and drop the color picker into my page. I resize it, and I want to use this color picker to use a color as a background in one of my sequences. To map the color that is selected to something in a sequence, I have to provide something to address. To use the color, I place from the source effects a layered 1D color effect into my sequence. And because a source effect is not complete, I have to define the background effect. And the background effect is a solid color 1D. Now to address this layer, I have to give it a name, an identifier, which has to be unique in the whole system. You have to enable the hide show display name and identifier icon to be able to assign an identifier. And I give this layer an identifier, and I call it color 3D background. So this is the identifier for this layout effect. If I now return to my graphical user interface editor, then I have here the color picker, and I can now map the color to this assigned identifier. Let's see if it works. I call my web browser, click F5, go to the output to see the effect. And now if I select a color, this is used as background color in my sequence. So this is the way you use a color picker. You can assign a color picker, and you can then use the selected color to be mapped to an effect as the color to be used. So far for the first steps using the graphical user interface and the ActionPad pages. I did not mention all the other things that are possible in the graphical user editor. If you select the background, you can select a background color or you can select a background image. You can address single elements in the graphical user interface editor and assign colors, gradients, and much more. It is too much to be shown in a video. At least this video is the longest one in the series we made up to now. But you can see here how you can use the ActionPad pages and the graphical user interface to control your show.